Instead of being taken to a psychiatrist in Washington or Maryland, Gottlieb and Lashbrook took him to an allergist in New York City, Dr. Harold Abramson, who was working with the CIA on its LSD experiments. Frank had 2 sessions with Abramson. After the first session he returned to this area, but when he got as far as Bethesda, he told me on the telephone that he was afraid to return home because he might do something wrong in front of the children. So he and Lashbrook returned to New York for a second session with Abramson. That night he jumped from a window of a 10th-story hotel room in New York in which he was staying with Lashbrook. Finally, Mrs. Olson explained the direct link between the LSD and her husband's death. My husband was a remarkably stable man. He had never had any psychiatric problems before he was fed the LSD in 1953. As President Ford put it when he signed legislation in 1975 providing $750,000 recompense to our family, the CIA's drug experiments were the proximate cause of his death. There is no doubt that CIA-administered LSD is what caused Frank's death. Mrs. Olson's personal recollections of the tragedy would not only underscore the magnitude of the negligence and incompetence of CIA officers Gottlieb and Lashbrook, but would also show the court that the government had already accepted responsibility for their misdeeds. There were even public admissions of responsibility from the highest levels of our government that Mrs. Olson could describe in court. When the Olson story finally became known despite the CIA's efforts at concealment, then President Gerald Ford met with Mrs. Olson and her children on July 21, 1975 and, according to a White House press release, expressed the sympathy of the American people and apologized on behalf of the U.S. government for the circumstances of Dr. Frank Olson's death in November 1953, and in the July 24, 1975 letter to Mrs. Olson, then CIA Director William E. Colby apologized for the CIA. I wish to join with President Ford in expressing my deepest personal sympathy and hope that you and your family will also accept my sincere apologies on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency for the suffering you and your family have endured as a result of the untimely loss of your husband. In 1953, the uniform reaction of the employees of the agency to this disclosure has been dismay and regret that this could have occurred. I can't find no explanation for why you were not fully informed of the circumstances at the time and apologize equally for that omission. On October 12, 1976, President Ford signed legislation providing $750,000 recompense to the survivors of Dr. Olson and, after stating that the LSD would appear to have been the proximate cause of his death, went on. The approval of this bill underscores the basic principle that an individual citizen of this nation should be protected from unreasonable transgressions into his personal activities. There should be no doubt that my administration is opposed to the use of drugs, chemicals, or other substances without the prior knowledge and consent of the individual affected. At the request of the family of Dr. Olson, I take this opportunity to highlight this continuing policy. These contrite apologies from the highest level of our government made it clear that there had once been a decision that those injured in MKULTRA should be compensated. In addition, we now had obtained additional CIA documents demonstrating that, in the wake of the Olson death, CIA Director Dulles ordered that the review board be created to oversee and control TSS research and experiments. But the Dulles order was not carried out and no other steps were taken to ensure that there would be no repetition of the reckless and negligent conduct in the Olson death. Despite the Dulles order, Gottlieb and Lashbrook were left in charge of MKULTRA without even a reprimand. 31 In that capacity they approved the funds for brainwashing experiments performed by Dr. Cameron without the review and oversight of the Special Review Board ordered by Director Dulles and with the same recklessness they had exhibited in the Olson death. 2. New evidence of CIA negligence in its relation to Cameron. One of Gottlieb and Lashbrook's assistants was John Cutler, who learned of the work of Dr. Cameron in the brainwashing field by reading an article appearing in the American Journal of Psychiatry in January of 1956. In preparing our case, we consulted Dr. Robert J. Lifton, an internationally recognized expert on brainwashing who had conducted one of the seminal studies of Chinese communist practices during the Korean War. Dr. Lifton agreed to review that 1956 Cameron article and Chu testified in court concerning the similarities between Cameron's techniques and the brainwashing procedures of the Communist Chinese. In Drive Lifton's expert opinion, the 1956 Cameron article described non-therapeutic and potentially dangerous techniques of repetition and isolation which were extensions of the totalistic methods of thought reform or brainwashing used in China and elsewhere. Lifton's view was subsequently corroborated by Cameron himself. In pre-1956 papers, Cameron had admitted that he conducted experiments with sleeplessness, disinhibiting agents, and hypnosis in an attempt to exploit the methods used to achieve the extraordinary political conversions which we have seen, particularly in the Iron Curtain countries. 32. We also asked Drs. Lifton and Salzman to study the Cameron application and to be prepared to testify about their opinions of it. They were in complete agreement that the Cameron application showed on its face that CIA funds would be used to conduct extremely dangerous brainwashing experiments. As Drive Lifton concluded in his affidavit to the court, it is clear from the Cameron application itself that these procedures were experimental and deviated from standard and customary psychiatric therapies in use during the 1950s. The procedures in the Cameron application closely parallel the techniques of thought reform or brainwashing used in Chinese prisons and elsewhere, and represent the mechanized extension of those brainwashing methods. In short, the Cameron application was a transparent proposal to conduct experiments with thought reform or brainwashing procedures extrapolated from methods documented in the academic literature, and would have been seen as such by anyone reviewing it during the 1950s. Drive Salzman likewise concluded in his affidavit, the Cameron application proposed a mind-control research project with no safeguards, no discussion of risks, dangers, and potential destructiveness. This is clearly outrageous, callous, insensitive, inhuman pursuit of an idea with no concern for possible destructive effects. It would be beyond any reasonable doubt that a foundation which supported such a project could not have had therapeutic expectations from the grant application. These conclusions were important parts of our case because the dangerous brainwashing experimentation described in Cameron's application clearly required some investigation of Cameron's competence and some provision for safeguards to protect the experimental subjects. As subsequent discovery confirmed, the CIA made no investigation of Cameron or his experimental procedures before making the grant, despite the obvious dangers to the human beings who were to be experimented upon with CIA funds. This is a prime example of the negligent failures to exercise reasonable care in the MKULTRA program that formed the basis for our second cause of action. We had found, moreover, dramatic evidence of the ease with which such an investigation could have been made. From 1947 through 1956, the CIA was in close touch with Dr. Owen Saland, chairman of the Canadian Defense Research Board during that time period. We contacted Dr. Saland, who provided us with an affidavit confirming that CIA had never bothered to contact him for his opinion about Cameron's competence, the departing and other experimental procedures used by Cameron, or whether it was appropriate to fund the experimental procedures used by Cameron. Drive Saland agreed to appear and to testify concerning the fact that he had disapproved of Cameron's destructive experiments and made his views known. Again, his affidavit summarized these views. I knew of the experimental departing procedures used by Ewen Cameron. In the early 1950s, the wife of one of my associates sought medical treatment from Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute. She was departed, and after seeing her I knew that this kind of work was something the Defense Research Board would have no part in. It was my view at the time, and continues to be, that Cameron was not possessed of the necessary sense of humanity to be regarded as a good doctor. My views of Cameron and the departing procedures were known to him, and I let it be known through Dr. Morton that I would not look favorably upon any application by Cameron to the Defense Research Board for psychiatric research. Cameron never applied for Defense Research Board grants to fund psychiatric research and would never have received such support had he applied. In addition, Dr. Saland was prepared to testify that there was a close relationship between himself and the CIA. During the 1950s, the United States Central Intelligence Agency had a resident representative of the United States Embassy in Ottawa who was publicly introduced as such. The CIA representative was liaison with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and was free to attend Defense Research Board staff and committee meetings where defense research programs were discussed. Formal information exchanges with the CIA were made by the RCMP, and the CIA and Canada exchanged all research information of mutual interest during this time. The security clearances issued by the Canadian Defense Department during the 1950s were accepted by any United States agency working in Canada, including the Central Intelligence Agency. Drive. Saland also noted in his affidavit to the court that there was another knowledgeable expert, Dr. Donald O. Head, who had been readily available to the CIA in 1956 and early 1957 when Cameron's application was being solicited and approved. Dr. Head, the highly respected chairman of the psychology department of McGill University during the 1950s, had worked closely with Canadian and U.S. Intelligence 33 and had an equally discrediting opinion of Cameron's brainwashing experiments. Unfortunately, Head had died before we could take his deposition. Because Head's testimony bore on Cameron's reputation, however, we were able to offer sworn statements of others about what Head had said without violating the hearsay rule. These statements relating to Head's opinions would not be offered as evidence of the truth of what Head had said, but as evidence that he had said it and would have warned the CIA to stay away from Cameron or at least make a full investigation of him and his work. In this way, we could avoid a potential bar of the hearsay rule to introduce the following sworn statement by Saland concerning Head's very low opinion of Cameron and his prudence in dealing with subjects. I know by my discussions both directly with Dr. Head and indirectly through Dr. Morton that during the 1950s, Dr. Head had a very low opinion of the departing and other experimental procedures used by Cameron and of Cameron's prudence in dealing with research subjects. Further evidence of Head's low opinion of Cameron's competence and prudence was provided to us by Ronald Bloomer, the documentary film writer and producer who interviewed Head shortly before his death. In their interview, Dr. Head stressed to Bloomer that Cameron was irresponsible and criminally stupid. Cameron's experiments were done without the patient's consent. Cameron was irresponsible, criminally stupid, in that there was no reason to expect that he would get any results from the experiments. Anyone with any appreciation of the complexity of the human mind would not expect that you could erase an adult mind and then add things back with this stupid psychic driving. He wanted to make a name for himself, so he threw his cap over the windmill. Cameron stuck to the conventional experiments and paper writing for most of his life, but then he wanted that breakthrough. That was Cameron's fatal flaw. He wasn't so much driven with wanting to know, he was driven with wanting to be important, to make that breakthrough that made him a bad scientist. He was criminally stupid. Bloomer summarized Head's statements about Cameron as completely escaping, with Dr. Head referring to Cameron and his methods several times as criminally stupid. Final corroboration of Head's view of Cameron came from J. Peter Tell, the research associate with the Center for National Security Studies, who had made an exhaustive review of the CIA's MKULTRA program. Peter Tell interviewed Head in the summer of 1978 and provided us with an affidavit based on his detailed notes of that interview. Dr. Head, look, Cameron was no good as a researcher. He was terrible. He did not have the faintest notion of how to go about doing experiments or doing research. But he thought he did. Dr. Head, he was eminent on the basis of politics, psychiatric politics and university politics, but not on the basis of research. Dr. Head, well, that was an awful set of ideas that Cameron was working with. It had no intellectual demand, it called for no intellectual respect. If you actually look at what he was doing, and what he wrote, his proposals, it would make you laugh. That is what I meant being awful. If I had a graduate student who talked like that, I'd throw him out. If Head felt this strongly in talking to strangers, we argued, it is clear what he would have said to the CIA if they had not treated this matter too casually to warrant interviewing him or anyone else. Indeed, the CIA formally admitted in court papers that, despite its close ties with Dr. Head, the agency never bothered to ask him about Cameron. Moreover, since Saland and Head were both working with the CIA in the 1950s, there can be no suggestion of secrecy reasons for not inquiring of them, only reckless and negligent indifference to the safety of the subjects of experimentation. In addition, we developed evidence that even casual inquiries of those in Montreal